All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Sean hEigeartaigh, who is the director of the AI Futures and Responsibility Program at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. His work focuses on the future of AI regarding foresight, governance, security, international cooperation, and more. So, Sean, thanks for coming on today.
It's a pleasure to join you.
So, just to start off, I'm curious to learn about how you first got interested in artificial intelligence, because I know you have a background in genome evolution. So I'm interested, how did you connect these two paths?
Well, I did my PhD in genome evolution at a time when it was really starting to take off in terms of we were starting to sequence a lot more genomes. So, the human genome was sequenced in 2000 and the costs dropped quite a lot over the 2000s, which meant that we could start sequencing a lot more genomes of species and start doing kind of comparative study to see what was conserved across species and where they diverged, and um, therefore kind of figure out what common ancestors would have looked like in terms of their genome sequences. And one of the things I really enjoyed about that was that it wasn't just a lab science. It involved a lot of stats and computational techniques. And during my PhD, I learned to program, and I learned to program badly, but well enough to be able to do some kind of basic probability and statistical analysis
Yeah.
on genomes. But I got curious around how would people do these kind of analyses with greater sophistication. And so I started reading around, and this was sort of late 2000s, so before machine learning had really taken off with AlexNet and so forth, and before deep learning was really seriously being applied to biology. But I started getting interested in kind of these questions about what sort of advances elsewhere might be applied to biology. I also got very interested in sort of questions more broad than the specific question I was looking at. So I was looking at what can we infer about the common ancestor of yeast species, 100 million years ago, based on the species in the world today, because they've had a really big impact on evolution on Earth. But it was clear to me that there was a kind of a broader scientific revolution going on with sequencing becoming more sophisticated and dropping in cost, annotation techniques getting better, and all sorts of analytic techniques sort of coming to maturity around that time. And so I got interested in what did all this stuff mean for the world. So I went looking for places that did more interdisciplinary work on these kind of things. And I was lucky that Oxford at the time, the Oxford Martin School, in collaboration with the Future of Humanity Institute, had a program on the impacts of future technology where they brought together scientists, philosophers, social scientists, governance people to really think in a sort of big picture way around where biotechnology was going, where AI was going in particular, and a few other technologies like technologies used in warfare and so forth. And AI was really the big topic there, and so I ended up getting drawn in while I was there.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a journey, but I think also probably a really interesting perspective to bring to the table when analyzing, the future of AI and something like that, because you have this, big picture perspective going back from the evolution of life to where is life going essentially today. Um, so I'm curious then, today AI is basically everywhere it feels like. I think a lot of people that never thought about AI a few years ago are now interacting with it to a certain extent, whether by choice or not. Um, you know, were you surprised by how much AI has developed in such a what seems like a short period of time for people that really are not connected to the field or were aware much of the development of it? Are you surprised by how it's kind of integrated itself in society so fast? Or
It's a hard thing to answer. I'd say yes and no. So I'm. It's always interesting to see how science and technologies sort of penetrate the public consciousness, if you will.
yeah,
Um, so the way I see it, machine learning actually started having some pretty big impacts on society in fairly sort of quiet ways, if you will, through the 2010s. Basically, machine learning allowed us to go from sort of hand coded kind of rule based systems to systems that were able to spot patterns in data and then make predictions based on that. And I think a lot of people were using AI maybe before they really knew they were using AI.
Okay.
So, if you were watching movies on Netflix and you were getting recommendations for things to watch, you were getting recommendations based on what you'd previously watched and what other people with your viewing pattern, had gone on to see next.
Right.
Same if you were using Spotify or so on. AI started being used for things like sort of efficiency of distributed systems, like connecting solar panels to the grid and a lot of those kind of things. And all of those actually matter quite a lot, and there's a ton of them, but they're not necessarily as attention grabbing or as eye catching as some other things. So, the idea of stopping driving cars really got the public consciousness, but they sort of went from, we got them to drive in the desert to getting to the level where they really were safe in cities and so on took longer than people expected. And so there was a bit of kind of a hype and disappointment cycle, although they're really starting to come in now. And then I think to a certain extent, everyone, including the people who developed it, were surprised that um, the ChatGPT moment had such a big public effect. I mean, there have been a
Yeah.
few of these moments over time. There
Right.
was the moment for DeepMind when their system beat the world's top Go player, and that had a big
Yeah.
impact, especially in the East. In the scientific community, AlphaFold by DeepMind had a pretty big impact because suddenly that was a very useful tool that could
Yeah.
make be helpful on a thing that uses up a lot of scientists' time in the process of doing experiments in biology. But ChatGPT, just like putting, and it wasn't necessarily the technology itself. Part of it was putting the interface in front of it so that you could just go on a website and ask it a question and get an answer. That sort of ease of use thing took the sort of transformer paradigm, which was progressing along, quite impressively from GPT-2 onwards, and it suddenly made it salient all around the world. And I guess, I mean, that makes sense in hindsight, but I think everybody was maybe a bit caught by surprise in just how salient it became to people when they could really interact with them in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's, I mean, it's a little spooky for someone who's not in the AI field to kind of see like the change where just a few years ago, no one had really even heard about ChatGPT or anything. And now, like, everyone not only knows about it, but many people are using it or will use it or the future versions of it. And just like, it kind of reminds me of when like social media first came about and it just kind of rapidly expanded really fast and became embedded in society. And now it feels like ChatGPT has done that, but I think it's obviously be given the tool, the technology of it, it feels like it's going to be much more embedded in different ways than social media ever was. So if that makes sense, but
Yeah, I think so. And I I still think that people probably, I don't know how much the average person has really explored how they can use these to be useful to them. I mean, I will admit I would have loved to have things like Claude and current iterations of ChatGPT available
yeah,
to me when I was in school or in university. Just being able to explore literatures and rather than try to find the right book, basically ask questions of a corpus of books and
yeah,
explore my disagreements with topics and just like delve into them. I mean, it's an amazing experience.
oh yeah, yeah. No, I think that I mean, as a tool, I feel like you can use it for so much. I guess the question becomes, well, how do people use it, and then also who's in charge of programming it, and in what way does that result in the answers you get? Which I suppose kind of how like social media can start to become politicized more and more depending on the platform and who's controlling it. And I suppose it wouldn't be surprising for AI to start going down that evolution. We're probably seeing that to a certain extent, I guess, but already. Um,
Well, there is certainly some of that. I mean, it comes down to various factors. Firstly, they are to a great extent a product of what they're trained on.
yep.
And so, most of the internet goes into the training data that these models are pre-trained on, although there is, various kind of filtering steps that are taken to kind of weed out like, low quality data. But you can, if you sort of choose a corpus of data and exclude certain things from it, that will affect the kind of answers you get.
Yeah.
And then there are various sort of fine tuning techniques. And there's a technique called reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is used to sort of align the models, which is a term for kind of make them behave in the way that we want them to. And RLHF, for example, it basically involves a bunch of effectively human testers, choosing between the answers that AI systems give to a question and, saying which one they think is a better answer. And that again sort of bit by bit shapes the behavior of models. And so, for example, a lot of work has gone into trying to make them, not be kind of racist in certain ways or not be biased in certain ways. But um, there's an extent to which all these things are relative. Like one person's, you know, perception of something as racist is another person's perception of
Yeah.
it as normal, and one person's perception of something as anti-racist is, another person's perception of something as, biased in a particular way, and that's, obviously quite a big debate at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that you can also, press these chat bots a bit to try to sculpt it to agree with you to a certain extent in these conversations that you have with it. So I mean, it does also reflect as kind of like a giant human experiment too, because you're basically trying to figure out like, well, to be successful with this platform, having a good amount of self awareness of your own biases is going to be very useful for like utilizing and maximizing, I guess, the most out of this tool. Because if you're using it with just like the mindset of just trying to get to tell you what you want to hear, it's probably not going to be as useful. So
Yeah. And there's been a really interesting example of this with, so OpenAI have gone through various iterations of their kind of mainline model. They have different models that they use that are, different levels of computationally demanding for different kinds of tasks, but they have, general models they use for their kind of general kind of ChatGPT chatbot. But one model that they had, and I think it was the main model last year for a while, was called 4.0, and it was very popular, but also somewhat problematic in that it was quite sycophantic.
hmm.
It would tell
Okay.
you that your ideas were wonderful, and it was very keen to tell you you're absolutely right, and so on, to
Yeah.
the extent that, people working within OpenAI were quite frustrated with this because,
Okay.
it's nice to be polite and it's nice to be encouraging, but you also want to be kind of truthful and accurate and give people sort of
Yeah.
well calibrated feedback and responses. And, the extreme case of this is, if you have somebody who, wants to do something, actively bad. Maybe they're, suffering from mental health and are
Yeah.
depressed and are considering something like suicide. This has been an example in the media recently. You don't want your chatbot saying, "Oh, self harm is a great idea. Go and do
Yeah.
that."
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, and so these kind of sycophantic models have been a concern for the companies, and Foro in particular, I think they have retired it, but they're what they found was that quite a big community of 4.0 fans emerged who were really, really keen on this very sycophantic model and very
Wow.
angry with OpenAI for retiring it. They felt that their best friend was being taken away from them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because I think for a lot of these people, perhaps they'd never had as patient and supportive, a set of kind of humans around them as this, endlessly patient and endlessly positive chatbot,
Yep.
and having that taken away from them was uh, a real sacrifice for them. But at the same time, the downsides are obvious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's basically kind of a natural element of using the tool where, to a certain extent, if a person uses this type of tool enough, it becomes almost therapeutic because you're asking it so many questions about so many aspects of your life
Mm.
or so many things where, yeah, you start to kind of, I think people often probably start to use it almost as like a therapist when trying to figure out problems in their life or learn information about something. So it is kind of interesting how, yeah, we're kind of treating it like a person almost in terms of talking to it.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm curious then, what would you say are like the common myths that people have about AI right now? Because I think there's a lot of different thoughts about, okay, where is this headed? What's happening with this? What can it actually do? From your experience, what are those myths?
Oh, there are quite a few, and I feel like I want to be a little bit careful about this because these things. Um, I mean, some of the things that I think have for a long time been myths are now unlikely, but not entirely certain. So, for example,
Yeah.
a myth in the past was, that these systems were in some way conscious,
Uh-huh.
and like there is a problem where they are very good at talking and acting like a human and giving the impression they have some theory of mind and so on. And um, certainly the primitive versions of these models, weren't that. They,
Yeah.
somebody described them, yeah, researchers in the field described them as stochastic parrots. They were trained on the internet and they were able to basically regurgitate, generate material that sounded very promising, but treating them like you were interacting with something that had moral value was completely ridiculous.
Right.
I think most likely that is also still the case. It's wrong to think of them that way, but it is interesting to track some of the research that's going into this because there are those who think that maybe that won't always be the case. And
Hmm.
I follow in particular consciousness researchers like David Chalmers, who's one of the biggest names in the field in terms of kind of academic philosophy. And I think he thinks there's maybe a like 20% chance that these systems are showing some sign of consciousness, which seems unlikely to me. But we may get to the point in coming years where we can't absolutely rule out the possibility that there is some level of consciousness in these systems. But right now, I think it's very unlikely.
Yeah.
And I think that it's quite it's quite important for the average person to bear in mind that it's very unlikely they're interacting with something that they shouldn't think of them as if they're people or and remember that they are kind of effectively machines are very good at producing
Yeah.
language that sounds like us. um, I think people can be both too dismissive and also too optimistic about these
Yeah.
things.
That makes sense.
I think sometimes people think that all they can do is give you kind of simple answers, and they hallucinate all the time. And maybe they've tried ChatGPT a couple of years ago, and
Yeah.
it made some stupid mistakes. They're getting a lot better over time, and in particular. One of the innovations of the last year or two has been what are called reasoning models, which are ones that effectively use a lot more compute at the inference stage, which is effectively the thinking stage, and perform a lot better on harder problems, things like scientific problems. And so it is worth engaging with them regularly, because it is a changing landscape.
Yeah.
Um, there are some other things where it's changing a lot, and there's been a lot of optimism about creating what are called agents. So effectively going from a question answering system to something that you could have sort of basically plugged into your computer,
Mm.
answering emails for you and booking your holidays and analyzing your Excel sheets, and where you could just like give it a task and send it off to work for hours on end.
Yeah.
And so far, this it's only starting to work in limited fashions, but I'm playing around with Claude Code at the moment, and it's a lot better than anything we had this time last year. And in particular, there are people now analyzing what's the longest task that an AI system can perform well at, with, let's say, a 50% chance of success. And I think the length of task is doubling about every 7 months or so. So um, that's something that's moving quite a lot. So I
Yeah.
don't know if these kind of really count as myths, but the main thing I'd want
Yeah.
to say is things are progressing. It's not always as obvious that they
Yeah, of
are.
course.
All you do is kind of occasionally interact with ChatGPT, but things are progressing, and it is kind of worth sort of engaging regularly with these things, because what was true in 2023 won't necessarily be true in 2026.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good nuanced answer, especially because of, these things are complex, and it's I think people kind of put themselves in a box if they're going to assume that they like this is definitively what is the case. Um, but I mean, you know, my background's in the field of big history, and so we look at things from like the essentially formation of the universe to the present and the different eras of time. Um, and people will talk about in that field like there's been more technological advances in the last 50 years and all of human history. So like, what would you say then if you think about AI 1,000 years from now? Could it become conscious in 1,000 years? Because that's
A
such a huge
thousand
amount of time.
years, I would say absolutely. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
but very uncertain. I mean, if you think in terms of big history, you think in terms of the lifespan of life on Earth, and what we might call intelligent life, and
right.
what the Earth's 4.5 billion years old, and I mean, you can probably answer for me. How long
Yep,
has there been like multicellular life on Earth? It's been
right.
upwards of a billion years, right?
Yep.
And then um, like Homo sapiens sapiens is, what would that be?
About
700,000,
300,000. Our species, 300,000. Yeah,
300,000. So on that lens, like 1,000 years isn't very much at all.
yeah,
On the other hand, we are making quite rapid progress on those kind of time scales, in fields like AI. And I personally don't, basically, I don't see biology as magic. And it
yeah,
seems to me that if it exists in, you know, biological wetware or whatever you want to call it, then that's a proof of principle that it can exist. And it
yeah,
doesn't necessarily need to be in biology. And if technology tells us one thing, it's that we can create things that are in some ways functionally equivalent to things in biology through other means. We have
right.
planes; they don't operate exactly the same as birds do. They borrow some principles, but
Yeah,
we brute force some other stuff, and we are able to, fly across the Atlantic. And those things are in some ways superior, and most ways or many ways inferior in terms of like the kind of level of sophistication of bird flight and so on. But there are many ways to solve these problems, and it seems to me that there's a very good chance in 1,000 years. What's really interesting is that the people who are leading the most advanced AI companies at the moment, they think it's plausible that they could create something of human equivalent or greater, potentially within the next 10 years.
yeah,
And
yeah,
they are very confident. I mean, they're not certain, but they, for example, Demosthenes has said he thought maybe a 50-50 chance in the next 10 years of something that would be able to make scientific breakthroughs as substantial as Einstein's theory of relativity,
yeah.
which, you know,
That'd be pretty
if
insane.
you can combine concepts in that way, then
Yeah,
you know, that's probably the greatest scientific breakthrough of the 20th century.
yeah,
So just the idea of being able to automate that, Yeah, so it is plausible, by no means certain, but it's plausible that we might see these kind of developments even within our lifetime, which would be incredible. I mean, that's not necessary to say it's likely.
Hmm.
I mean, I might say less than 50% likelihood in my own estimation
Yeah.
in my lifetime, but that is a sufficiently momentous possibility that I certainly think that we should be thinking very carefully about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting question is, and obviously there's so much that goes into this, but to what extent are, the people at the head of these AI companies, talking about things out of hype, or talking about things out of just they're kind of, so embedded into the field that, they kind of believe their own hype to a certain extent versus, the reality of what can actually come about within that period of time.
I certainly think there's a selection effect for optimism in terms of thinking this is possible. And there's a sort of, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some degree of echo chamber in that, you put a whole bunch of people who are sort of inclined to be optimistic around this together in one
Yeah.
place, and they encourage each other. But I don't think, for at least some of them, I don't think it is cynical hype. And I don't think it's entirely unfounded. I mean, if you look at the backgrounds of the people who set up DeepMind, for example, Demis Hassabis, Shane Legg, both people who have been students of AI and of cognitive science for many decades, and who were making these predictions and kind of laying out these possibilities long before they had, however many $100 billion companies that they needed to sell. I mean, Shane Legg was predicting that um, human level AI would be possible by the end of this decade, way back in the 2000s. Haspis was writing about this for a long time. Like even Sam Altman, before he had ever set up OpenAI, was thinking about these possibilities, and you can like read old blogs that he's written about it. Same with people like Dario Amodei. I'm a little less sure about, everybody in the field. It's entirely
Yeah.
plausible to me that some people are getting kind of caught up in the hype. Like I have no idea what someone like Mark Zuckerberg really thinks about this. I mean,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
sort of see him as coming from more the social media side, and this being like the next big thing for him. But
Yes. Yeah.
certainly for those who have come from the science of AI and who've been thinking about it for a long time, I think they are, what we're hearing is their true beliefs. I think they are bringing a lot of expertise to those views, and they are no doubt optimistic. But I don't think they're just sort of selling hype for the sake of investors. Although it is kind of interesting. One of the things I reflect on a bit is that this whole kind of selection effect, where the people who are most sort of bullish, if you will, about the current research paradigm predominantly went to industry because it's very much a resource heavy paradigm where you need to have a lot of computing resource and access to huge kind of training pools and so on. The people who are more skeptical about it stayed in places like academia,
Yeah.
and that has that kind of, from my perspective, kind of a selection effect in both directions. In academia, you have a lot of people who are very skeptical about the claims that people within the tech companies are making, and they talk to each other quite a bit. Within the industry, some of the claims to me sound like slightly unrealistically ambitious, and it's hard for me to tell, is that because they are over ambitious, or is that because they see something, inside the companies at the coal face that I don't necessarily have access to? It's probably some bit of A and some bit of B.
Yeah.
So there is some kind of social kind of selection effect stuff that is likely going on, but I think it would be irresponsible to entirely dismiss what they say. I think we should be taking what they are saying quite seriously, even if we, consider that they may be over optimistic about it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair perspective on it. It is amazing. Just there's so many different claims that people are making. I feel like in the at these companies about how it's going to revolutionize or change society, whether it's like curing diseases or ending work where people don't have to work anymore and AI will do your do your job for you or something. Um, but there's also people that have talked about like the potential for human extinction. What do you make of these different avenues? Since obviously they all potentially, I guess, lead down different paths, and I don't know. I guess if they all come true, I'm not sure. Maybe they could all come true, but and then all coalesce and have one grand impact. I don't know.
I mean, honestly, I think all these are plausible depending on how quickly and in what direction the science goes. And when it comes to things like curing diseases, so practical caveats, having a really good AI is not enough in itself just to cure all diseases. You still need to actually do experiments,
Yep.
and that these things take time. I think sometimes we're a bit over optimistic about, oh well, if we had these great tools, we'd immediately cure cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever. But you still need to do experiments, and that usually means experiments on long-lived animals like humans, and there's still ethics considerations, and there's still time needed to see if your intervention is going to have an effect, especially with things like Alzheimer's, where a lot of ethical issues and very long time scales involved. So a caveat that there's a lot that can be done in terms of drug discovery and in terms of like analyzing information you're gathering about kind of experimental cohorts, but there are some fundamental limitations, I think, that mean that things aren't going to massively accelerate overnight. Um, but I still think there's huge avenues for progress across the sciences, where whether it's in analyzing the literature and spotting gaps, running experiments, once we get robotics up to speed, running experiments in parallel using kind of robotic labs and so on. Um, there's a lot I think that can be done in energy, using these technologies to make things like solar cheaper and more efficient and more reliable. They're being DeepMind are applying it to containment for nuclear fusion, which is the kind of thing that who knows if it'll work out, but if it does, that's another like once you have cheap energy, you can do nearly anything with cheap energy.
Yeah.
You can start desalinating seawater and irrigate land, and you can just do a ton with very cheap energy. Um, and yeah, so I think there's a huge amount that you can do. It it's not magic, and there are still going to be some constraints. I do think it's going to have a really big impact on employment, and it will create or it will aid in the creation of new jobs. But I think it's premature right now to assume that for every job that gets lost because of AI, equivalent job will be created because of AI. I mean, that's an assumption, and I think it's by no means guaranteed, and I think it's more likely that it won't.
Right.
Even with sort of the progress on the technologies we have at the moment, without major breakthroughs leading to things like human level AI or superintelligence. If you think about something like the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't just that somebody, made the steam engine and then suddenly a bunch of, previous jobs went away. There was a long period in which lots of kind of hand done jobs like hand weaving sort of got like refactored and reorganized in such a way that different tasks got regularized so that they could then be done by machines. And that took some time. And, decades and decades, probably hundreds of years. You probably know better than I do. But I think we'll probably see a lot of the same sort of thing with AI as we figure out how to sort of regularize and adapt a ton of the intellectual work that we do and the work that goes through digital interfaces so that it is compatible with the AI that we have. It won't just happen overnight, but and it doesn't necessarily even mean that you need all aspects of a job to be automated. But if the work of if one paralegal can do the work of 10 paralegals in the past, either you need 10 times as much paralegal work to be done, or you need fewer paralegals.
Yeah.
And the same across a whole load of other things. So then the question becomes, how many more jobs do you get? So I think it's actually not a premature time to be thinking about what if we don't actually see the same number of jobs in the future, and what if close to full employment is not the future we're going towards, but we're still getting richer as global societies because of technology. How do we actually make sure that the kind of economic benefits of AI result in better quality of life for people? So I think all of those are questions that really should be asked right now,
Yeah, that'd be
because
good.
you have huge, like right now, like our society is very much based around a model where most people work, and you know financial stability is centered on having jobs, and self-worth, and social mobility, and all these things. And if you decouple those, I think you could have some very bad outcomes. So there's a lot of thinking I think should happen around those things, even in the absence of breakthroughs leading to human level intelligence or beyond. Then the kind of second bit is, what if Hassabis is right? What if Dariamade is right? What if Sam Altman is right? And I think we should be thinking very carefully about what if they are right. It's a 50-50 coin flip, whether or not they're right in the next 20 years. We are like in half of worlds bringing something into existence that is potentially kind of more intellectually capable than us across the board. And there, I think there are some pretty big risks. I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to how easy is it for a kind of less smart thing to control a more smart thing. And I mean, Jeffrey Hinton puts this
Yeah.
well. It's like the track record of less smart things controlling more smart things is really not good. Chimpanzees are stronger than us. That really doesn't help them that much.
No.
And
No.
so I think there are some really big risks there. And it worries me that we're rushing into it so quickly. I mean, yes, if we get it right and if we design them so that they have our best interests at heart and so on, maybe they can help us like discover physics that we never would have ourselves and advance science faster and better than we ever would ourselves. But if we don't get those design principles right ahead of time, it's going to be very hard to kind of shut down or intervene beyond a certain point, because they will be more capable than us, is fundamentally what it comes down to. And one of the things that worries me the most about all of this, I realize I've been talking for a long time now,
No,
but
it's good.
I spend a lot of time writing about this. But
No, this is
one of the
important.
things that worries me the most about all this is that, particularly in the last couple of years, we've fallen. When I say we, I guess I mean like the global we, have fallen into a bit of a trap of this stuff all getting kind of tied up in not only commercial interests but also geopolitical interests. And you can't open a newspaper these days without hearing about the AI race between the US and China. And if you read some of the policy reports or the public articles coming from the big companies, not DeepMind, I will say, but certainly Anthropic and OpenAI and others, they talk about the need to get to these incredibly consequential thresholds in as quickly as possible, because otherwise China will get there first and then they will be the global hegemon and that'll be bad for the US and so on. It seems to me that developing, going down this path in a hurry and trying to get there before a perceived adversary is probably the most dangerous possible sort of circumstances in which to develop such a consequential technology. And it's something that I you know, would very much like to see us be a lot more careful about, and which I sort of argue against whenever I can.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, it sounds like you're describing, the super intelligence that people are worried about in the AI field. That you would basically get so smart you couldn't control it, and if that could have a domino effect. Obviously, there's geopolitical risks of like who has what technology and how can they use it against each other. But in terms of humanity as a whole, the concern is that there would be an AI that's uncontrollable, that you were kind of talking about a bit. You know, Historically, it's really hard to cause a mass extinction of a species, especially one that's spread out as the U.S., where you have people in New York City or in the middle of the Indian Ocean and on Sentinelese Island, little isolated tribes. People are all over the place. So, like, how would you imagine then an extinction scenario would play out? Would it be, AI manufacturing some type of bio weapon, or controlling nuclear missile systems? Because it does seem like, yes, though there have been mass extinctions, this would be um, a totally different level of extinction to wipe out the human species. But
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really good question, and I agree with you. I recently reviewed the literature on potential causes of human extinction, and nearly all of them are very unlikely. I mean, even a big asteroid, it like could do it, but they come across, across our path, many hundreds of millions of years apart. And everything else, even natural pandemics, it's really hard for them to reach everyone. The the problem with coming up with a specific scenario for how, for example, a superintelligence would do it is that kind of baked into the scenario is that this thing is smarter than me and can do types of kind of scientific breakthrough that I can't
right,
even conceive of.
yeah,
But in principle, if you had an incredibly sophisticated command of all of the sciences that we have and all the engineering that we have, and we're able to progress all those things beyond what we currently have, um, maybe you'd change the composition of the atmosphere so that it was no longer compatible with what we need to breathe.
that would not be
Or
good.
maybe
Yeah,
you would release some sort of biological agent that would kill us off, or maybe some sort of, you know, like, nanotechnology, or maybe you would, I don't know, maybe you just build tons of tiny little killer drones that would just kind of go around the place knocking off people. I don't like to spend too long kind of trying to come up with all of these sort of
yeah,
nightmare
of course.
scenarios because it feels a little bit morbid. But it like if it was better than like all of the best scientists and had access to like every bit of science we'd ever done and was able to go beyond it, it seems like it would find a way.
Yeah,
And like something else that might happen is like, what if it was just indifferent to us in the way that we have historically been like broadly indifferent to many of the species that we co-inhabit the earth with? Like we still have chimpanzees and gorillas and yeah, pick your species on earth, but we certainly don't. We limit how much of the earth they have access to and how much of the earth is compatible with their way of life. You could imagine AI systems that were indifferent to us basically turning an awful lot of our land masses into some sort of substrate that was more useful for them. Perhaps like you know giant computing facilities, or something else industrial that I can't quite imagine at the moment, that wasn't. I mean, think of the amount of the planet right now that's taken up by human habitation and human agriculture and various other things. I mean, we're using up a lot of the planet. And, an AI system that was just indifferent to us would probably be as intolerant of that as we would be of, I don't know, chimpanzees using up as much of the planet as we currently do.
yeah. I mean, it almost kind of gets to the point where it almost becomes philosophical in terms of like what does it even mean to be like super intelligent or more intelligent than us? Because I think one of the ways that we gauge intelligence as a human species, even if we don't necessarily are successful at it consistently, is empathy. And you would think that if empathy is a key factor in intelligence, and perhaps something more intelligence would recognize like maybe it's not so good to just go and wipe out you know life on the planet or whatever. Um, but I guess it's just a question of what how we define intelligence in the first place is something that I guess AI and whatever it would develop would end up answering that to a certain extent.
Well, that's right. And I'd like to think that a core part of intelligence is empathy, and that if we developed AI that was more intelligent than us, it would also be more empathetic and would just be morally better. If
Yeah,
you think of humans at the moment, like even at like in the modern day, our track record of behavior towards each other is not as good as I think we would want from AI towards us. Our track record towards other species is not as good as we would
nope.
want from AI to us. Like if you flipped a switch and made us be able to do faster and better science and engineering, but nothing else. I mean, I'd be interested in your big picture lens on, or not big picture, big history lens on
Yeah.
would that be good for the world? Would it be good for other species? And would it be good for humans? Because what I worry about here is that it seems to me that intelligence can take lots of different forms, and we could have lots of different versions of it. And it's entirely plausible to me that it seems to me potentially easier to develop systems that are better at scientific analysis and engineering analysis and um, you know problem solving and strategic planning and you know taking action, like all those kind of practical steps that have been the things that in large part have allowed us to have such a big footprint on this planet. Like it seems to me that like we can see pathways for developing faster, more efficient, more powerful ways of doing that in silicon, whereas there are a whole load of the kind of ethical and moral and kind of sociological stuff that we're still struggling with. And I'm not confident that we'll just magically get the ethical, moral, and social
Yeah.
stuff with the scientific
Right.
and engineering stuff. And if we only, if we get the scientific and engineering stuff without all the other stuff, and we make it like, you know, way more powerful than our ability to do those things, then I think we potentially do have a really big problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think even to a certain extent, it becomes not even a question about intelligence, but almost like programming, because you could essentially create something that, as you're kind of talking about, is basically just purely about production and and creating things or whatever that it deems are important, but not having the emotional intelligence or self-awareness to think and recognize its own place in the universe, or trying to understand or like hypothesize like the meaning of its own existence, like people have struggled with for thousands of years. So yeah, I mean, I do see how like the dangerous thing would be creating something that is completely maybe like incredibly good at the skill set needed to be very productive and successful at creating things, but not having the ability to rationalize because it's not programmed at all in that way. And it's purely about production versus, perspective, I guess.
Yeah. And I don't think that's necessarily what people are trying to do at the moment. And to a
Yeah.
certain extent, maybe we have an advantage in that if we develop superintelligence from the current paradigm, if it has, some layer in it that, gets trained on, giant corpus of human data, it's already absorbing a lot of not just our scientific knowledge, but also our cultural knowledge. And certainly when you interact with, Claude or ChatGPT, it is able to at least do a facsimile of human moral reasoning fairly
Yeah.
well. If you ask it,
Right.
the answer to moral questions, it gives you like pretty decent moral answers. But one of the big questions is you know, how deep does that go? Is that skin deep? Is it kind of, a sort of an answer that doesn't necessarily mean anything, or does it reflect, a true understanding of these things? And that's really what the whole field of alignment is about. Are we actually able to develop systems that not only kind of right now reliably behave in the way that we want, but that actually have in them somewhere values that are kind of compatible with our values, or who we would like our values to be, such that when we eventually get to systems that are more powerful than the current ones, and potentially even more powerful than um, you know any broad kind of intelligence that we've had on the planet so far, the outcome is good. But there are just a ton of unanswered questions there, and
Yeah.
we don't really understand how these systems work. And right now, it seems like we are able to make these systems more capable more quickly than we are able to make them understandable to us. There's a whole field of interpretability, which is trying to understand what's actually happening within these systems, like which bits are activated during and which kind of processes. And it's making some progress, but they get things to work with 2023's models when 2025 models are like much bigger and more powerful, and it's really hard to keep up with how fast the capability side of this is going. And that's a concern, and it's another reason why I think rushing into this in kind of within a competitive dynamic is a really bad idea.
Yeah, it does. You start to wonder, what exactly, where does this lead? And I guess that kind of makes me think of my next question, which is just reflecting on what you know about AI today. How would you describe this moment in human history for let's say future historians, if they exist, assuming that the world assuming our species doesn't go extinct, but who may listen to this interview or something and try to make sense of what people are going through at this time and this technological revolution with AI.
Yeah, I I mean, what really characterizes this moment for me, and what I'd want to sort of, I guess, project to future historians, is the kind of radical uncertainty of this moment. I expect that, future historians looking back in 100 years will be like, oh, well, you know, this was like either on the path to, AI becoming kind of a normal technology like electricity that got integrated as tools in a whole load of things. And some people had some crazy beliefs about AGI and superintelligence, but that then fizzled out. But it was kind of obvious it was going that way. Or they'll look back and it's like, oh, well, this was the moment in which, like, it was really taking off and it was becoming obvious that these things were the seeds of super intelligence, and the smart people had woken up to this. And if you were like looking carefully, it was obvious, because often, like, when we look back, it looks more obvious than it was.
Right. Of course.
Like, if we'd been around when like Leo Szilard was trying to warn people about nuclear chain reaction, like, would we have known, oh, Szilard was onto something here? Like, he knew that this thing could result in the nuclear bomb. Or would we have been like, well, this, like, couple of random scientists are saying this thing that just like is mind-boggling and that must be wrong. Like, I'm not sure why it's wrong because it has a bunch of crazy physics in it, but it must be wrong because like the consequences of it are just too insane. Um, so I think we can look back and maybe things look too obvious in hindsight. And I feel like the uncertainty is what makes this crazy. And it kind of manifests in a bunch of different ways. If you, for example, this coming year or two is possibly going to be the year in which like the AI bubble bursts, because you've got these massive investments and all the companies are basically borrowing from the future for bigger and bigger training runs, on the basis of expectations of systems that will be really kind of economically and scientifically transformative, because nobody's going to drop $1 trillion on a giant kind of infrastructure project for a slightly fancier chatbot.
Yeah.
So maybe like the bubble bursts, or maybe it's the year in which these things really, really become economically transformative, and you start seeing 5%, then 10% GDP growth driven just by these things. Or maybe it's both. Maybe like you have a bubble bursting, but you're over the sort of hump of this in the way that you had the dot-com bubble that still led to the revolution following the internet. So there's like these kind of somewhat opposed but possibly compatible views of maybe there's a bubble, maybe it'll burst, maybe we're going to see a giant scientific and economic revolution, maybe AI is going to be just and I say just like the new electricity that gets embedded in everything we're doing, but fundamentally sort of humans end up being the people who figure out how to use these tools and who figure out what it gets applied to and so on. But maybe Hassabis and Shane Legg and Dario Amodei and all these like really smart people are right, and they develop something that is able to automate general relativity in the next 15 or 20 years, at which point we are no longer the driving force of intellectual progress on our planet, and our place is permanently and irrevocably changed, and we need to figure out what it is to be human in a world where like in the same way that like no human's ever going to be the best chess player on earth anymore, no human's ever going to be the best scientist in any field. And I feel like all these options are on the table at the moment.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing that I would kind of try to project forward. Like it's probably going to look obvious in hindsight, but right now I feel like it's incredibly uncertain. The other thing is it feels insane to me. And the bit of it that feels insane to me is that we are rushing into these incredibly consequential decisions where we're very uncertain on the outcomes and where experts vehemently disagree, driven by what, like, from a big history lens, are the most banal of considerations. Getting there before another company, or getting there before a perceived geopolitical rival. And the third bit of it is it's incredible the concentration of decision making around all of this. Maybe people look back and it's like, oh, humanity decided to do this thing. No, humanity didn't. A very small number of people leading companies who are able to then convince investors that they will get returns on their money are making decisions to proceed on things that they think have a non-trivial chance of wiping out humanity or making humanity irrelevant. We are not having a global conversation about, is this what people want? And that to me is insane. Like, it seems like historians might look back and they'll be like, yeah, this was a decision that affects every single human being on earth, and there was just no global conversation happening around it.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel like we are in an era where we have, I would feel like the greatest leadership globally to be handling such questions. So yeah, it does seem like a kind of a fork in the road on many different sort of issues here. But we'll just hope for the best, I guess.
That's all we can do.
Yeah. So what's the best way for people then to keep track of your work, and what are you working on currently at the moment?
Well, I'm working on a couple of things. Basically, most of the things I write are online, and you can find them on the website for my academic center, the Center for the Future of Intelligence, which is primarily based out of Cambridge. So if you go there, you can find links to my blogs and papers and so forth. At the moment, I'm working on a paper looking at looking at the US-China AI race narrative, and particularly the influence that the tech industry has played on promoting this narrative. And why I'm doing that is that I think often it feels like a very organic narrative. It shows up in, you know, newspapers and in policy submissions and various other things. But I think it's under recognized just how much it's been kind of developed and pushed by a range of tech companies and investors, including the defense industry over the last 10 years. And I think people just be aware of that this is a narrative that is used to push for a lot of priorities that benefit companies in various ways. And I have no doubt that a lot of the people who are kind of making this case firmly believe it as well.
Yeah.
But it is also one that is I think quite useful in terms of arguing for like greater federal investment in AI research and rollout of infrastructure and energy build out and data center construction and laxer environmental laws and access to copyright data. All of the things I've just mentioned are things that the AI race with China has been used as a justification for in policy documents. So um, I think it's worth just being aware that there's a strong corporate influence in
Oh
what
yeah.
really should be a political and geopolitical discussion. So I'm working on a paper on that at the moment.
Awesome. Yeah, very, very relevant and timely things. But Sean, thanks again for coming on the podcast and for sharing all your knowledge on literally an incredibly historic topic that will probably change the world in quite a few ways. So, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. And it's been an absolute pleasure, and I really enjoyed discussing with you.